Today, we are going to continue our discussion of America's involvement in Latin America. Specifically, we will be focusing on Central America and the Caribbean. So, let's get started. Just to recap, over the last few weeks, we have spent a lot of time discussing these two terms, progress and neocolonialism. The era of progress, as you know, was a time when Latin American nations pushed to industrialize their economies. It resulted in the construction of factories, commercial farms, communication networks, and railroads. It also led to a growth in the economies of these nations as they expanded the amount of goods they exported to the world market. These goods were things like coffee, chocolate, bananas, rubber, tin, copper, and other minerals. But building the machines to do this work, for example, the mining equipment, the railroads, etc., this cost money. And that's where neocolonialism came into play. In fact, by 1914, Latin American governments had borrowed more than $10 billion. Now, where did they get this money from? Great Britain was the leading investor in Latin America, followed by the United States, France, and Germany. Now, the problem is that with these loans, I should say, came foreign influence. And often, foreign influence hurt efforts to build democratic governments in Latin America. Why? Well, for one thing, efforts to bring democratic reform to Latin America often led to revolution. Revolution destabilizes a nation's economy as well as its government, and that can hurt foreign investment. Therefore, if foreign governments or companies invested heavily in Latin American governments, it was in their economic interest to encourage stable governments. And that often meant dictatorships. For example, American companies loved Porfirio Diaz in Mexico because he kept American investments in that country safe for more than 30 years. He also oppressed his own people, of course, but United States companies didn't really care about that. Another great example of U.S. influence in Latin America was the Spanish-American War. In 1898, the U.S. invaded Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, all territories held by Spain. Now, why did the United States go to war with Spain? There were many reasons. Many young Americans saw this war as a great adventure. The Civil War had been 30 years earlier, and so many young men romanticized the adventure of going off and fighting in a war. Others had more noble motives. They wanted to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. Now, neither of these was the real reason why the U.S. government declared war on Spain in 1898, however. The real reason was sugar. Cuba was one of the world's largest sugar producers. However, Cuba under Spanish rule was incredibly unstable. The Cubans had been in a state of revolt against Spain for decades, and this was taking a toll on U.S. access to Cuban sugar. The war will change all that. With Spain out of the way, the U.S. had as much sugar at low prices as it wanted. These motives can be seen in what happened after the war was over. The United States wins the war easily. In fact, one American politician will even refer to it as the, quote, splendid little war. With Spain's surrender, Cuba was in fact granted its independence. The United States also took control of Puerto Rico, a small Caribbean island just east of the Dominican Republic. But that's not all. The war is also an example of American neocolonial policy. As I said, Cuba won its independence from Spain, but that independence came with strings attached. Those strings can be seen in the new Cuban Constitution. To be honest, that new Cuban Constitution was basically written by the United States. This Constitution, in fact, contained a passage known as the Platt Amendment, which said that the United States could intervene in Cuban affairs whenever the U.S. thought it necessary. Why? Why would the United States insert something like this into the Cuban Constitution? Well, the United States wanted to keep Cuba stable because it feared that instability in Cuba might hurt American interests there. But that's not all. The United States will continue to expand its influence in the Caribbean. The next target will be Panama. Now, Panama was originally a province of Colombia. With the growth of global trade in the 19th century, talk began about the need to build a canal somewhere across Central America to unite the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Work on such a canal began in 1881 when a French company acquired the rights to build that canal across Panama. The effort was a disaster. Specifically, the problem was disease. Malaria and yellow fever devastated the workers, killing more than 20,000 between 1881 and 1889. The French company ultimately just gave up. And that's where things sat until 1903, when the United States stepped in. Specifically, the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in. Roosevelt was a tireless booster of U.S. expansion overseas. He fought in the Spanish-American War, and once he became president, he continued to push for increasing U.S. interests in the Caribbean. One particular interest of Roosevelt is a Central American canal, and Roosevelt really wants to build that canal across Panama. But he fears such a canal will never be built as long as Colombia continues to govern the territory. Thus, when Panama revolts against Colombia in 1903, Roosevelt supports that revolution. And once independence is won, Roosevelt negotiates a deal with the new Panama government to build an American canal. The canal was completed in 1914. Above is a photograph of President Roosevelt operating one of the massive shovels that dug the canal. But that's still not all. With American interests in Cuba and now Panama, Roosevelt wants to ensure that these nations and others in the region are safe for American business. Thus, in 1905, he declares what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary. The Corollary is an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine, which had been originally declared in 1824. The Monroe Doctrine had declared North and South America closed to future European colonization. But now Roosevelt takes it farther. He declares that to prevent Europeans from getting involved in the Americas, the United States will act as a sort of regional policeman, intervening in unstable Latin American nations when it sees fit. And these are not idle words. The U.S. will send troops into numerous Latin American nations over the next 30 years. There are American troops in Haiti from 1915 until 1934, American troops in the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924, troops in Nicaragua from 1912 until 1933, and still others. So, in conclusion, the United States was a neo-colonial power in Latin America. In Cuba, that neo-colonial interest was driven by sugar. And in Panama, American neocolonialism was driven by the desire to build a canal. As we will see in future lectures, however, this is only the beginning.